Hi, the people are doing. So, two things that I really want to clarify right here, right now. It's simply that the Oppo Find X7 Ultra, I did manage to get it imported to me from China, and well, the price actually came down for it, so I was able to get it around 1 lakh 5, I guess 1 lakh 8,000 rupees, Indian rupees, and that's fairly reasonable considering that most Ultra flagships do come in at 90 to 1 lakh. The S24 Ultra is way more expensive than that, but yeah, you get the point. The X100 Ultra from Vivo. Now see, that is the latest flagship. It would make sense to have that imported, but it's way too expensive. I'm telling you right now, I think it costs somewhere around like 1.5, 1.6 lakhs after everything, and that's too much for me. It's impossible for me to do that budget-wise. If the price comes down, then yes, I'll try to get that imported as well, but for now, this is what we have. And you know what? I've heard so much about the Find X7 Ultra. It is mind-blowing that I finally have it and I can finally test it. I can finally compare it because everything that we have here, oh yes, let's jump in, shall we? So kicking things off as usual, we have the color profiles. We got the vivid profiles over here from both the Oppo and the X100, and well, it works. It's fine. I'm not the biggest fan of vivid profiles, so I don't really want to comment on it. It looks fairly nice on both, nothing particularly wrong with either, so that's nice. However, what I personally prefer are the natural color profiles. Now, with the Oppo Find X7 Ultra, the regular color profile that you have, the base level automatic color profile you get from your photos, it is a natural color profile, which honestly I'm a huge fan of that because it just works so well, as you can tell right here. The X100 Pro with its natural colors, it already looks stunning and very realistic. The Oppo is right there with it. And yes, we have very overcast conditions, which can often mean that you get really flat looking photos because you don't really have the natural light and the contrast that comes along with it. But well, in certain situations like these, I would say that you do get an option for the textured mode, which is supremely high contrast, as you can see from the X100 Pro. The Oppo doesn't exactly have anything as such, but I gotta admit, the X100 doesn't look particularly good, mainly because it looks really underexposed. If the contrast was bumped up, whilst also balancing the exposure perfectly on the X100, then I would have probably preferred the X100 here. But well, that's not really happening now, is it? Now we got a main camera close-up, and as you can tell, the Oppo can actually focus on the subject that is closest to it, the flower right up front and center right there. You can see the Oppo is focusing perfectly, as opposed to the X100, which is not really doing that now, is it? Now then, I guess this would be a miserable attempt at trying to get a backlit shot because that's about as much sunlight as I could have gathered at the given moment. I mean, look, we have not had any proper sunlight for like 3 to 4 days. I love that stuff, personally, but it's not very good for camera comparison, now is it? Well, look, at the end of the day, there are two things. First and foremost, the HDR, the shadow detail, all that stuff is great. Even the contrast is being balanced near perfectly on both. I have nothing to complain about in that regard, but I do think that the white balance, especially the sky, it looks a little bluish on the X100 Pro with the main camera here, as opposed to the Oppo, which is giving us a much more realistic kind of grayish look to the sky, which is exactly how it looked when I took the photo. However, when we switch to the ultrawide camera, well, take a look at that. Now the X100 Pro has basically perfect colors, like there's really nothing else for me to say here. The Oppo, as you can tell, it has more saturated greens than what was perfectly real, and it has that blue tinge in the sky, as opposed to the X100, so the tables have kind of turned when we switch to the ultrawide camera. Here's another ultrawide shot, and this time the differences are significantly more exaggerated. I mean, take a look at it. So much more blue in the sky on the Oppo. Now, look, if you like that stuff, good for you, maybe that's the way you want it, but the fact is this. When you're thinking about objective reality, the X100 Pro is doing a better job. Just like the Oppo Find X7 Ultra was doing a better job with the main camera specifically. With the ultrawide, it's the X100. And now finally, yes, I managed to get a backlit ultrawide shot. And this is way more backlit than what we had with the main camera, but well, look, the difference in overall looks and the contrast, all that jazz, it looks fairly nice and fairly similar on both. I don't really have much to complain about. Maybe, I guess, the X100 Pro is crushing shadows a pinch more as opposed to the Oppo, but it's not that massive of a difference. What I do prefer on the X100, once again, are the colors. Both the color of the greens, the leaves, the grass, all that jazz, and also the color of the sky, which is exudingly realistic right there. Man, this is just ludicrous, I'll tell you. So what happened is that I took all the photos that I needed to do the whole macro part, but then I forgot to shove them in to do the commentary bit that I usually do and have been doing so far, hence the voiceover. Oh boy, having a sore throat really throws you for a loop, doesn't it? Anywho, with the ultrawide cameras, I would say that the macro capability is just a slightly bit better on the X100 Pro because it can just get a little bit closer. That's about it. With the telephoto cameras, of course, now that's a whole different story because both of these can use their telephoto cameras. You have to use the 6X on the Oppo, but at the end of the day, the photos are just stunning. You can't really get as close as with the ultrawide, which is a little odd, but I really like the look of the photos so much more. And secondly, finally, we also get a 2x sensor crop on the telephoto with the X100 Pro. It essentially gives you what I think is like the absolute best macro capabilities in almost any smartphone. There are very few that can even compete with this. Now, once again, we're switching back to the main camera, this time for zoom, and it's the same story as we saw previously. The X100 Pro now has more bluish tones in the sky, and the Oppo is doing a much more realistic job. And that's, well, you know, it's just a little odd that both of these phones have one camera out of the two major ones that can produce perfectly realistic results. It's just interesting, to say the least. Now, moving on to 2x, yes, I know, I messed up the framing a little, but, well, it doesn't really matter all that much. Mainly because I used tap to focus on the same exact part on both phones, so it should alleviate any concerns at all in that regard. And overall, I do think that the X100 Pro has touch more detail, but it also has more processing, and this is a trend that you'll see carried forward in many other images as well, because that's just the way the X100 does things. It will produce more detail, more fine detail, especially after 500% crop, but you'll also get more processing and sharpening. Now then for 3x, and yes, the Find X7 Ultra, it has insane levels of versatility. I mean, a 3x and a 6x periscope telephoto camera. The only other phone that does this is the Xiaomi 14 Ultra, which, man, that comparison is gonna be fun, don't you think? This Find X7 Ultra versus the Xiaomi 14. We'll get to that soon enough, but for now, let's crop in. And look, it's not gonna be a surprise, right? The Oppo is gonna produce more detail. It has a proper telephoto camera. The Vivo is not far off, and that's partly because the X100 Pro has really good detail preservation with its main camera, which is why it can produce incredible 2x sensor crop, and even the 3x is not horrible, to say the very least. Now, the X100 Pro does come in with a 4.3x telephoto camera, which obviously at this particular focal length, the Find X7 Ultra will naturally not have as much detail because it is just doing a digital crop from the 3x. And cropping in, you can tell immediately just how soft the Find X7 Ultra looks. The difference is drastic. And I'd actually expected the Find X to perform maybe a little bit better, but well. And then for 6x, look. The X100 Pro is not bad. The 4.3x telephoto camera that it has is very high quality. It does produce really good shots, and even when you zoom into 6x with the X100 Pro, it is producing a fairly sharp shot, but it's also very sharpened, as you can tell. The Find X7 Ultra, its optical zoom, of course, it looks stunning. It is supposed to look stunning. Then at 10x, and this time I would say that the Find X7 could use maybe a pinch more sharpening, and the X100 Pro has a whole lot more. Way too much, to say the very least. It's very obvious that it is being sharpened and processed, whilst I guess the X7 Ultra is just trying to maintain a more natural look. Moving on to a 30x zoom, and well, you know, surprisingly, both are very similar in this case. I guess both of them could use a little bit more contrast, especially the Find X7 Ultra could use a little bit more contrast. That would actually bring out the details even more, but to be honest, it's not that far off on either, which is kind of like a compliment for the X100 Pro if you think about it. Now look, truth be told, versatility isn't going to be a problem per se on either of these, but at the end of the day, it is the Find X7 Ultra that has significantly more. It literally has another telephoto camera right there. It is gonna pull ahead. However, moving on to the high-res shots, now you see, all of the rear cameras on both these phones have 50 megapixel modes, but the Find X7 Ultra, as you might remember, it has a whole extra sensor right there. But with the main cameras, once again, it's a very obvious trend, isn't it? The Oppo just doesn't sharpen its image nearly as much as the X100 Pro. Now, there are certain pros and cons to that, I guess, because the X100 Pro does look significantly more detailed and sharper, but it's also very processed, and you can tell that there is processing and sharpening happening, especially with the textures and some of the edges and so on and so forth. There is visible processing there. I guess if both of these would just split the difference, a little bit of sharpening for the Find X and a little bit less on the X100 Pro, it would be the perfect shot. However, let us move on to the ultrawide camera, and yes, I forgot to take the ultrawide high-res outdoors, so it's indoors. It is basically the exact same thing that we saw previously. The X100 Pro has a little bit more sharpening, and you can very easily make out that it is processing certain details. There's a bit of haloing going on in some of the finer details, like some of the spots and so on and so forth. The Oppo, on the other hand, goes for a much more natural route, which personally I actually prefer. Now, of course, with the 3x on the Find X7 Ultra, we also get high resolution. And yeah, the X100 Pro looks horrible and flat. I don't know what happened here. It's a bit overexposed as well. The Find X7 Ultra's balancing with the contrast is perfect, just so you know. And as you would expect, when we crop into 500%, naturally, the Find X7 Ultra is gonna do a better job. Like, did we expect anything else? I don't think so. And once again, very similar to what we saw with the zoom shots, the 4.3x telephoto with high res on the X100 Pro. It's obviously gonna do a better job, right? And well, just for the sake of it, I did zoom all the way in, and yeah, the difference is beyond massive. It should be, as anyone would expect. And the advantage once again goes back to the Find X7 Ultra with the 6x, because again, this is not something that the X100 Pro has. And so cropping all the way in, you can tell that yes, the Find X7 Ultra does have a little bit of grain happening, but the amount of sharpening and processing that I can see right here on the X100 Pro, it is significantly higher as opposed to the Find X7 Ultra, for a good reason. I mean, the Find X7 has both high res and a 6x telephoto, so it should be producing better results. And so here's a little conclusion that I've arrived upon before we jump into the selfies. It's essentially that the 3x, the quality of the 3x on the Find X7 Ultra, it's not as good of a sensor, or at least the shots that come out of it, both regular and high res, are not as good as the shots that come out of the Vivo X100 Pro's 4.3x telephoto. But the Oppo, as you would expect, kind of makes up for it, since it also has a 6x telephoto. This is literally hardware brute forcing its way and just regaining the advantage when comparing against the X100 Pro. But let us get back to the selfies. So I don't mind how the Oppo looks, and yes, I turned off all the beauty settings, don't worry about that. But I do prefer the X100 Pro simply because it has slightly better contrast, and I also think that the skin tones look a tad too yellowish on the Oppo. It's not that big a difference, but the contrast being lowered and it looking a little flat is not really doing it for me. Now here's another selfie, and this one I feel is a little bit more side-lit, so to speak. And here's the thing, the X100 Pro, it looks good. It does have realistic white balance, and I also kind of like the contrast overall, but take a look at my face. It does appear as if Vivo is kind of brightening it up a little bit and maybe mellowing out the contrast. The Find X7 Ultra is doing a much better job at making it look realistic, so to speak. So I guess because of that reason alone, I kind of prefer the Find X7 Ultra. I mean, it's my face. That's supposedly the most important part of the photograph, isn't it? Anywho, with a backlit selfie on the other hand, yeah, it appears... well, it doesn't really appear. It's very obvious that the Find X7 Ultra cannot handle backlit shots. The Vivo doesn't struggle, not in the slightest, as you can tell. Now moving on to portrait selfies. So here's the thing, I actually prefer how the Find X7 Ultra looks here, because not only does it have really nice contrast and skin tones, but you'll notice that my face doesn't have as much brightening happening as we see on the X100 Pro. However, I do have to mention, the edge detection is slightly better on the X100 Pro. Now here's another side-lit portrait selfie, and yeah, look, I like the contrast on the Find X7 Ultra, but I do believe that the overall balance that we're getting on the X100 Pro might be something that most people prefer. So my personal preference does go to the Find X7 Ultra, but do let me know, do you prefer the X100 Pro in this particular case, with the much more mellow approach with the contrast? It's probably going to be the case, but I'd like to know. However, one thing that I can tell you for sure without even the slightest shadow of doubt is that the Find X7 Ultra once again cannot handle backlit selfie portraits. Selfies and selfie portraits, both of them, when it's backlit, it just can't do it. I don't know why. I tried changing up the angle, I took multiple shots, it's just the same situation every single time. On the other hand, the X100 Pro produces basically a perfect result, which is kind of insane when you think about the difference right there. Now for night selfies, look, neither of these are particularly good. The X100, sure, it has more brightness, but it also makes me look like I'm made of candle wax. The Oppo, on the other hand, yeah, I look like... I don't even know what I look like. Just forget about it. What I do know is that, to this date, there's only one smartphone on the planet, well, at least among the ones I've used, that can handle night selfies, and it's the S24 Ultra from Samsung. Now let's move on to rear camera portraits, and once again I have to point this out. The Find X7 Ultra really likes to warm up and just inject yellow into my skin tones. I mean, just take a look at it. The X100 Pro is doing a perfect job with it, just the white balance, the way it's handling everything. Also bear in mind, I did take these indoors, but the light coming in from outside was from overcast situations, so the slightly cooled off color tones you can see on the X100 Pro in both selfies and portraits is perfectly accurate. That's really not the case on the Find X7 Ultra. It's not bad, obviously, but it's not accurate now, is it? Similar story here with the 35mm mode. I mean, it's more than obvious that the white balance definitely needs some work on the Find X7 Ultra. The portraits it produces, the way it handles contrast, details, everything else really is good, but the skin tones and the white balance in general, they need to be fixed. Now for a backlit portrait, look, at the very least, the Find X7 Ultra did not do whatever the hell it was doing with the selfies, but yeah, this is underexposed. The X100 Pro, considering the situation once again, is producing a really nice shot. But I did manage to get a shot that looked like this on the Find X7 Ultra, which is very close, actually a little bit better as opposed to the X100 Pro. Now, it only happened once. Of I think the 5 images that I took, every other image was underexposed on the Find X7 Ultra, but it was quite an interesting anomaly that we found on the Find X7 Ultra. Now moving on to 2x selfies is 50mm, and yeah, similar story. Look, I think that the Oppo just warms up my skin tone a little too much for my personal taste, and it is also unrealistic inherently. So if you're shooting in a warm condition, I can't even hazard a guess as to what might happen to my skin tones. I might go all nuclear. The X100 Pro on the other hand, look, at this point it has been proven over and over that it produces some of the best bloody portraits that you can possibly imagine. Now for 75mm or 3x, actually it's 85mm on the X100 Pro, and remember, it doesn't have any optical zoom camera, the Vivo that is. This is a quality you get directly from the main camera. It's pretty insane just how good the processing can be, especially with portraits when you're trying to shoot 85mm. Now, on the Oppo Find X7 Ultra, I think this time, in this particular instance, it is producing a really nice looking shot, and I don't really mind the slight hint of warmth that we have in the skin tones. Now here we are using the 6x on the Find X7 Ultra and 100mm or 4.3x on the X100 Pro. I gotta admit, both are doing a really good job. This is also backlit, by the way. It looked really nice, the framing that is, and honestly I kinda expected the Oppo to kind of mess this up, but well, it's doing a tremendous job. I'm obviously not disappointed, now am I? Now moving on to night portraits. Obviously, without question, you want to take these kinds of portraits with the main camera. You don't want to use anything else. And considering that, I would say both are doing a really good job. The X100 Pro does go for a generally brighter approach. That's just the way it rolls. The Oppo, I really like what's it doing here. I don't know how anyone else is gonna feel about this. I personally don't really care much. What I can tell you is my personal opinion on this. I really like the approach on the Find X7 Ultra way more than the X100 Pro. I think maintaining the nighttime essence of any night mode shot should be something of extreme importance. And that is something that I personally think is very important when it comes to any kind of night mode. This is a perfect example. The X100 Pro looks fantastic, it looks great. So does the Find X7 Ultra, but immediately my preference goes to the Find X7 Ultra simply because it has, first and foremost, a much more nighttime looking shot. In that regard and in terms of contrast, the X100 Pro is good, but the night sky is really what shifts me towards the Find X7 Ultra. It just looks so much better, so much more realistic as opposed to what is happening with the Vivo. Here's another main camera shot, and look, we have more lights in the foreground here, but the story is basically the same because we are getting a sensational shot from the X100 Pro, don't get me wrong, but the Oppo just looks like perfect nighttime. And that is very important for me. That realistic approach is very important for me. It might not be important for you, so use your own judgment here. But my personal preference will almost always go to Oppo because of its approach. Now, in this particular case, I guess it's very similar again. The night sky, I mean, it looks ridiculous on the X100 Pro. So much blue. And yes, enhanced night sky is turned off, in case you're wondering. The Find X7 Ultra, it has a very good approach in that regard. It doesn't have as good highlight preservation as opposed to the X100 Pro, but it also has a little bit of a problem with lens reflections. Just so you know, the X100 can more often than not handle lens flaring and reflections a little bit better as opposed to most of the flagships. But in this case, I would say with the ultrawide camera at least, it's very similar. And even the night sky looks much closer to reality on the X100 Pro as opposed to what we have been seeing previously. With the ultrawide camera, it does look a little bit better, a little bit more up my alley, I guess. But again, the Oppo Find X7 Ultra is closer in terms of reality, so that is what once again gets my preference. Now, I do want to reiterate, it's a personal preference that I'm giving you right here. I don't really care what you or anyone else has to say or think about this, because my preference is not going to change. Now, keeping that in mind, in this particular case, look, this is a very difficult shot. There are a lot of fine details, sky in the background, and more often than not, with the ultrawide cameras at least, this particular subject, this tree right here, I've used this previously as well, and it always buckles most cameras. I would say the Find X7 Ultra is doing an overall better job. It has more detail preservation, it has less smearing going on, and on top of all that, it is handling both the lens flaring and the night sky better. So look, that's way too many advantages in my books. Now finally we can take a look at zoom. So we're starting off with 2x. Now ideally you don't really want to use 2x in general because 2x sensor crop doesn't exactly work all that well at night. It does work a little bit better than in most cases with the X100 Pro, but with the Find X7 Ultra you can very easily tell that it's really not meant to be used at night. To be completely fair, it is a minor difference. But then with the 3x camera, now the thing with the Find X7 Ultra, as you can see here, is that it is producing once again a very realistic result. The X100 Pro, the reason it looks balanced is because it is actually really boosting up the detail in the shadows. The complete pitch black that you're seeing on the Find X7 Ultra is actually how it appeared to my eyes when I was taking these shots. But well, despite that, obviously with the optical zoom, the Find X7 Ultra is going to pull ahead, especially when it comes to nighttime photos. If the sensor quality is good, then optical zoom will always triumph. And the same is obviously true with the X100 Pro when you're trying to use a 4.3x telephoto. Because just as you would expect, the X100 Pro does produce more detail, significantly less grain and noise as opposed to the Find X7 Ultra. Although I do gotta admit, it doesn't exactly look like $1 million on either here. Now finally we've got a 6x. Now this obviously should be a place where the Find X7 Ultra pulls ahead, right? It does have that optical periscope zoom right there. Well, it's not really the case because you can tell there was a bit of a breeze, and obviously the Find X7 is struggling with a bit of smearing in the foreground, but even the background, the details back there as well, they are not really all that good. And it's actually the X100 Pro that is doing a surprisingly good job here, which is odd to say the least, but well, that's just the way it happened. So that brings us to the end of this comparison. I gotta admit, the Find X7 Ultra really does feel like the big brother of the OnePlus 12, doesn't it? Because essentially, most of the issues that I had with the OnePlus 12 have been resolved on the Find X7 Ultra. Yes, it's more expensive, it is the Ultra flagship from Oppo, all that jazz, all that does come into play here. That is the reason why it feels more polished. But it's just interesting to say the least. And look, the simple fact that the Find X7 Ultra basically kept up, for the most part, as opposed to the X100 Pro, it's a huge deal. Like, that is a massive compliment because in my opinion, the X100 Pro is the best point and shoot camera for regular folks that just want to take out their cameras, take a photograph, maybe play around with some of the settings, and that's it. The X100 Pro is by far the absolute best. The Find X7 Ultra kept up extremely well, right? There were some issues like warming of the skin tones with the portrait mode. That was definitely a bit of a problem for me. I'm not really sure how the Find X7 Ultra is going to perform in daylight. Obviously, I do want to find out if we can have daylight, that is. But the point is this. At this point in time, I don't really think I can form proper thoughts. I have to compare against other flagships with other situations and so on and so forth. So I'll see you guys soon enough with that. Stay tuned. Cheers.